Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be aligned with your love, O God, our strength, our courage, and our freedom. Amen. This morning's gospel lesson of the Transfiguration of Jesus that Sherilyn just read has me thinking about Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The connection between the story and the arch, as Archbishop signs his emails, has to do with the radiance and the glory of Jesus reported about him by Peter, James, and John after Jesus has been talking with God on the Mount of the Transfiguration. Jesus and the closest members of his Lenten small group, Peter, James, and John, have gone up on a mountaintop to pray. While there, they all have a glory attack. The scriptures actually testify to that. They tell us that Peter, James, and John see Jesus in all his glory. Remember, St. Irenaeus defines the glory of God as the human being fully alive. Peter, James, and John see Jesus as fully alive. His face is radiant, like that of Moses, when Moses had conversations with God, as reported in Exodus. And in this moment of glory, Jesus' clothes even seem to shimmer with dazzling brilliance. All because Jesus has been conversing with God. Now, I have frequent conversations with other people about Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And we always, in these conversations, talk about his bubbly, radiant presence. If there's someone I personally know who is authentically fully alive, who lives in his glory, it is the arch. When he's around, the energy of joy, truth, justice, and acceptance literally bubbles up and bubbles out to touch those around him. You can feel his force field. And in these conversations I have with other people behind the arch's back, the conversation always comes around to the fact that he often spends a total of 4 hours in prayer every day. Morning prayer, evening prayer, a daily Eucharist, and time alone in contemplation. Whenever he is here with us at All Saints, he always requires a silent place to go and collect himself prior to preaching. And the last time he was here, just a couple of years ago, when he and I returned to my office after the procession out, he said to me, "Man, stand here and give me a minute to thank God for that marvelous liturgy." So, closed the doors. He sat in one of the chairs in my office with his eyes closed, his head bowed, his hands folded in his lap, while I kept the crowds at bay. And after 5 minutes of silence, he was up, opened the doors, man, and he started greeting and embracing and laughing and slapping people on the back and standing for pictures without any hint of fatigue or irritation. That is the radiance I imagine beaming off the face and clothing of Moses and Jesus after their time with God. They were transformed, transfigured, shining, fully alive. There was an energy shift in them and around them. And there can be an energy shift in us and around us as well. That quality of daily existence is intended for you and me to have in our lives also. It is not just a gift exclusive to Moses, Jesus, and Desmond. That passage from 2 Corinthians that Deborah read says that the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of Christ as though reflected in our mirror, are being transformed into the same image as Jesus, from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from Jesus himself, the Spirit. In other words, not only is Jesus being transfigured in this morning's story, you and I are to be transfigured as well. Not only is Jesus transformed in this morning's story, you and I are to be transformed as well. And furthermore, since it is by God's mercy that we are engaged in this ministry, St. Paul continues, we do not lose heart. Now, I like from time to time to read from the contemporary kind of colloquial translation of the Bible called The Message, and it is helpful at this point. Whenever we recognize that God is a living personal presence, it says, translating 2 Corinthians. God not being, when we realize that God is not a piece of chiseled stone, and when God is seen and understood and accessed as personally present, a living spirit, our old constricting laws and scripts and narratives, I'm adding in a word or two from here and there, are recognized as obsolete. We're free of them. All of us. Nothing between us and God. Our faces, Paul says, can shine with the brightness of Jesus' face. And so we are transfigured and transformed like the Messiah, our lives gradually becoming brighter and more beautiful as God enters our lives and we become like Jesus. And since God has so generously let us in on what God is doing, we're not about to throw up our hands and walk off the job just because we run into occasional hard times. I have a friend who works in a very stressful job in a federal agency in Washington, D.C. And she was here during one of Archbishop Tutu's visits. And he had such an effect on her that when she becomes aware that she is overstressed in her office in D.C., she tells her staff that she has to have a few minutes in her office alone. And she tells them that she is going in there to get her tutu on. For she seeks to radiate the hope and confidence and encouragement emanating from the arch. She gets her tutu on and then comes back out of her office to continue her tasks. Repeating Paul. We are transfigured, much like the Messiah. Our lives gradually becoming brighter and more beautiful as God enters our lives and we become like Jesus. Since God has so generously let us in on what God is doing, we're not about to throw up our hands and walk off the job just because we run into occasional hardships. Ash Wednesday is this Wednesday. Easter is coming as early as it possibly can. Easter will be here even before April it gets here this year. So every year, the church's liturgical calendar has you and me read a version of this transfiguration story on the Sunday before Ash Wednesday, so that you and I can be prepared and fortified for that 40-day journey of Lent. This is something that I feel so passionately about in theology. You and I don't get fortified body, soul, spirit by looking at a cosmic transaction between God and Jesus, or God and Moses, or God and Desmond Tutu. You and I get fortified by getting in on the act ourselves, by accessing that energy for ourselves. Too much of fundamentalism and too much of Christianity is content with letting people be petty and the way they always are, because Jesus and God have done it for me. And I don't have to get in on the act and be transformed myself. And that is hogwash. Jesus is interested in, he says in John's Gospel, you can do greater things than I have done. But you and I can't do greater things than Jesus has done unless we use Jesus as our model to get in on the act ourselves. It's not just in the cosmos, it is between God and us here in our hearts, and between us. Back to my transcript. So this morning, after the 7:30 service, a worshiper held me back right there and asked to speak to me. And he said that his life was so stressed by caring for a parent who was sick that he had come to church planning to ask me for an appointment so that I could somehow solve this thing. And then during church and during the sermon and during the Eucharist, he realized that he, and these are his words, I have gone weeks without getting my tutu on. Without getting in on the act myself. Without accessing the fully alive energy that God has for me. And then he said that he had already begun feeling transformed and transfigured just by being in church this morning. Lent, among other things, means letting go of everything that's false in us. Letting go of everything that doesn't have our name on it. Letting go of those behaviors and labors and stresses that are not a part of who God has made us uniquely to be. Letting go of all that stuff that doesn't fit with who God has called us, summoned us uniquely to be. And that's a painful thing, particularly when you over-identify with your false self. So Lent is not always a walk through the park, letting go of your false self. But whether Lent comes into your life in February, like the liturgical calendar, or sometimes in March or June or August or December, the fortification that we all need is to know what we need to do to get our glory on, to get our tutu on, to access the light of God within us. We need to reconnect to that force field that is God, that is the divine, to let us in on what God is doing with the grace and mercy of God in the world that generously flows out to you and to me without limit every moment of every day, without condition, and is asking you and me to let it flow out of us to other people That 2 Corinthians passage says, since God has so generously let us in on what God is doing, we're not about to throw up our hands and walk off the job just because we run into occasional hard times. What a compliment for God to tell you and me what God is doing in the world. The telephones always go off at the right time. That was an important statement that I just made. Thank you for not turning off your cell phone. When have you ever heard that in church? The marvelous gift I've received from Archbishop Tutu has been his reminding me in his presence, his preaching, and his teaching that you and I live in a moral universe. God is in charge, where absolutely every human being is interconnected, and that every human being is of value, and that we cannot be a human being alone, or we cannot live without the human community. To be a person is to be a person with other persons, and that, as Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it always bends towards justice, and that every human being, to use the Arch's words, every human being is a God carrier. Now that's a different narrative and a different script and a different theology than a lot of us were raised with. A friend of mine who's a spiritual director told me about a woman who came to see him, and her presenting issue was that she could not get her dead mother's voice out of her head. And her mother said to her all the time, you are not going to make it, you are not worth anything, and your dreams don't matter. So settle for less. And he looked up this passage in Luke, the Transfiguration story, and gave it to her and asked her to go off and pray with it for an hour. And she came back transfigured. Her face was radiant. She was glowing. The frown had turned to a smile. And he said, what in the world happened to you? And she said, I read that sentence where the cloud came away after Jesus had been talking with Moses and Elijah. And the voice from heaven came and said, this is my beloved, this is my son, this is my chosen, listen to him. And she said, I heard that I could listen and pay attention to Jesus' voice of compassion more than I could listen to my mother. The concept of narrative is a very important concept that I'm reading referred to everywhere, that all of us inherit a received narrative, some kind of received script. Sometimes for me, I'll just speak personally, part of my own received narrative as growing up as a Christian that needed some expansion and needed some letting go of the false self was that people of color were not as valuable as whites, women were not as valuable as men, gay and lesbian folks not as valuable as straight folks, and foreigners not as valuable as Americans. That is what is called a toxic narrative. It was not good for me, it was not good for the world, and it's not sustainable. And whether it feeds the church or it feeds national foreign policy, it is a part of the false self system that we have to let go of in our Lenten journey, so that we can embrace what is called a generative received narrative. The generative received narrative that we get from Jesus and the 8th century prophets. And, in my estimation, the great wise founders of the global religions. Everyone is a gift from God and a bearer of God. We live in an interconnected universe. And that is why we at All Saints have the agenda we have of being against violence, oppression, and prejudice, being against assassinating people by remote-controlled drones, by being against torture, by being for marriage equality, for being against violence against women, and on and on and on. God is compassionate, full of loving kindness. God raises people from the dead. God helps them get rid of their false selves and become their true selves. God has so generously let us in on what God is doing that we don't ever have to throw in the towel when life gets tough. And when you and I listen to that received narrative, when we get our tutu on, when we are transfigured and transformed by listening to God, you and I can transfigure and transform the world. Amen.